Okay, so this is just a quick screencast on the narrative essay. I wanted to give you some things to look for, um, some things about narration that hopefully you've already read this in the slides if you've been following your online activities. So, storytelling is one of the most ancient uses of language. There's no accident that the word story is hidden within the word history because it's really a collective of stories and experiences that people have shared over time. But because people rarely agree about the meaning of events, it's important to understand that history is constructed. It's not just a record of the facts, but interpretation of facts from particular perspectives. In every successful story, there's always something at stake, some kind of conflict, sometimes between good and bad, sometimes a conflict of opposing forces, the struggle to make a decision. And so every successful narrative has some form of conflict. So, what's important to remember, it's always got to be more than just a record of events. When we talked about the descriptive essay, we talked about description being is just a list unless it has meaning. And the same with a narrative. Because these stories are personal, these stories are your interpretive spin on something that happened to you in your lifetime. And it doesn't make any difference if the events are factual or fictional. You can tell a story and embellish ideas from it. However, it cannot, the series of events cannot be interesting. It cannot be a story until you put them in a context that makes them meaningful. And stories always reveal the personality, the values, and the character of the storyteller. This perspective is what makes all the difference in a great story. What actually happened is never fully, completely, and impartially represented. Okay, so you want to narrate the event from your perspective. Now, the details are going to be really important in your personal narrative. Hopefully, you've been online and you've checked out last year's. Those of you at Donahoe, you've checked out those senior readings, those stories, and you'll notice that there's no two stories that are exactly alike. And part of why we're doing it this way is to allow you a lot of freedom in creating your own personal narrative. Maybe a time that you learned a lesson, maybe a time that you experienced an event that was memorable to you or that shaped you in some way. Something funny, something sad, something heartbreaking. It's your narrative, it's your story. But what's going to make your story great are those details. It's those details that are going to make that difference between just a story and then a good story and just a summary of events. Details are the things that allow us to see, as the reader, to see things very clearly and visualize. They allow us to meet people, not just generic characters, but real individuals that you've come across in your lifetime. And they also are going to convey all this, the sensory details, the sounds and smells and tastes, whenever these other senses help the writer make their point. Also important for a narrative is the structure. Most stories consist of events that occur sequentially in order from the first to the last all the way through. Obviously, the most obvious way is to organize it is to put it in chronological order. However, if a story is well told, it may be unnecessary to announce that point. And putting that up front, the point of the story putting that up front may spoil the effect, like telling the punchline before a joke. Skilled writers don't always tell stories in chronological order. Often they rearrange the events, violating that order of chronology to place events where they will have the maximum effect on the reader. That's that plotting that we talked about in the 7 common moves. This is the way you choose to arrange your story. It takes a great deal of skill to tell a story out of chronological order without making it seem jumbled and disorganized. So there's no wrong way to do that. But if you are going to tell it out of chronological order, say you start at the end and come back to the beginning, or you start in the middle and come back to the beginning and finish it all the way through to the end, just make sure that you do that with a string, with your with a clear idea in mind of where you want to go, so the paper doesn't seem disorganized. So I asked you to, in your journals, to brainstorm your own personal narrative, event from your childhood, a life changing experience, travel story, story of loss, time you learned a lesson, time when you tried to fit in or stand out or march the beat of your own drum. Could have been about a last play that cost you an important game, or a time when you triumphed overall and won a victory. What is something that defined you in your past or is continuing to define you in the present, and what is your story? And so those are just some ideas to kind of help you get started. I gave you 2 sample texts to read, Jackie's Debut and Unique Day, and that was all about when a young man witnessed prejudice for the first time when he was able to see Jackie Robinson play, and why that story was important. I also gave you Falling into Place as a model essay by Jamie O'Neill about the time when he tried to impress 2 young girls by climbing up into a tree and then jumping down, and it was quite a bit of a fall. And so to give you 2 very broad topics of personal narratives that both have significant meaning, or have changed the author in some way. And so I asked you to, for journal 2, I asked you to revisit your journal 1. You were supposed to kind of brainstorm some ideas, and then I wanted you to select the idea that you felt most compelled to write about. And so that is where you should have been ready to write your personal narrative. Let's take a look then at a recipe then for personal narratives. So when you narrate, think like a writer. Don't start out trying to prove a point. Start with a story, and then as you draft the story, try to discover what it is that makes your story worth reading. That's the main point. That's the so what factor. Once you've discovered that, you have a basis for making a judgment about what to include and how to arrange it to create the effect that you want to create. And so there's a recipe that you can follow for narration. And then I just kind of wanted to go through that with you really quick. Choose a series of events about which you feel differently from the way that most people feel. Arrange the events in a series that will maintain the interest of your readers. Obviously, we talked about that possibly being chronological, but you can decide to weave back and forth in time as long as you are organized in a way that there's not a disruption to the flow. Look for opportunities to enrich your story with details that give the reader a sense of being on the scene or witnessing the events firsthand. That's your figurative language, those sensory details. Look for opportunities to use dialogue, the actual words spoken by the people in your story. And dialogue is most effective when it reveals something about the person who speaks it. Just putting in, hey mom, how was your day? My day was fine, thank you. It doesn't reveal anything, and it's unnecessary. The 5th thing is to create an ending, and that's usually when you resolve all the problems or answer all the questions raised in the story and tie everything together, which is a successful conclusion we've talked about in 7 Common Moves. And then I told you that you should share your draft to see if your strategies have the effect that you want them to have. Read the story out loud to someone, tell the story out loud to someone, and see if they have the effect that you want them to have in your that you're going for with your story. Just a couple of things really quick. Remember that successful narratives have a plot, and a sense of plot, a sense of conflict, some kind of thing that needs to be solved or figured out or resolved in the end. It needs to have organization, either chronological or that you can weave back and forth in time as long as it doesn't affect your flow. It's got to have those descriptive details, figurative language, sensory language. But remember that from Essay 1, details without meaning are just a list. So make sure that those details are meaningful. Details are going to make or break your story because it makes the difference between a story and a summary of events. You want to avoid summary. So make sure that you check out this recipe for narration. Also, make sure that you check out those rules for commas that I put in this unit. A couple of things that I noticed on overall on the essays were the use of passive voice. Remember that you want to make active constructs as much as possible. So, who or what is doing the action instead of the action happening to them. Make sure that you go for passive every time that you can. Semicolon use. I'm going to put some stuff in this next unit at the beginning, some punctuation tips. Semicolons are used to join sentences together that are of like-minded structure. They're talking about the same or similar objects. But you shouldn't be using a whole lot of semicolons unless you're using a conjunctive adverb, like you end a sentence, use a semicolon, and you use therefore, comma, to start the next sentence, a conjunctive adverb. But again, it's for sentences that are closely linked together. So watch your semicolon usage. And then watch that awkward construction or awkward word choice. Remember that with your voice, you want the essay to sound like you. So trying to use words that you consider to be we call them $5 words, like you think that that's going to be more impressive. But if you're not using them correctly, or if you're using them awkwardly, it really stands out. And a good way to solve that is to read the essay out loud to yourself or to someone else, and you'll be able to catch a lot of those simple errors in awkward construction or awkward word choice usage. So I'm looking forward to hearing your stories, and I will get back with you guys soon.